I got this Deadpool figure from Revoltech in the mail the other day, and he's a very flexible figure, and I thought he'd make an excellent photo. So I set him up in my light box, and the idea I had was to set up with some dramatic lights and use the fog machine to get a dramatic background. However, when I started taking shots, I realized that that concept was not really working for me. So I decided to switch gears and composite the Deadpool with the same pose into a different scene. The scene that I chose was the shot I took several years ago of the Graffiti Alley in Toronto, Ontario. It just seemed to be the perfect marriage of the character of Deadpool and the background scene. So I needed to pivot and go from a dramatic in-camera shot to a composite shot. And the rest of this episode is really how I went from one to the other.
So the first thing I'm going to do is get my background set. And so what I've done is I've imported that Graffiti Alley image into Photoshop and I straightened it out a bit. And then I'm just doing some tweaks to make my background the way I want it to be. So that way when I start adding in Deadpool, I have a target to work towards. So the first thing I did was just to tweak things. I darkened the light in the background a little bit and added a darkness contrast layer just to darken everything up. Because I straighten the image, I have these little weird angles at the sides that are clear. So I use the spot healing brush to fill those in. And then I darken the edges some more. The people in the background got removed. And then I added this light glow just to give the scene a little bit more punch. And then finally a little bit of vignette around the outside to put the focus more towards the center. So this is the background that I'm targeting. So the next step is to add in the Deadpool from the previous shoot and to see what we're working with. So I did that here. And the method that I'm working with is that I need to be able to see Deadpool and the background at the same time, but I don't need it to be perfect. So what I'm doing is grabbing a very quick mask. And the way I do that is like grab the quick selection tool, grabbing the scene, just doing a select subject, and then adding in like the sword and just doing a very, very quick select, just something like that. Just so it's I can see the background. It's absolutely not perfect, but it's good enough for the investigation. And I'd rather spend just a few minutes or a few seconds getting a selection than multiple minutes because I'm going to iterate through this and I don't want to have to do it a bunch of times. And once I get the final shot that matches, I can go back and take the time to capture a better selection. This is my very first shot, and I've done absolutely nothing to match the background in the foreground. So we can start comparing the differences and see what needs to be tweaked for the second iteration. And we're just going to go through a process of examining what we have in this part, seeing what needs to be changed, going to the actual studio setup, make those changes, take another shot, bring it back here, and then see how it fits, take more notes, and go back and forth and iterate until we get Deadpool into a position where he fits properly into the scene. So there are three things that are hard to do in post. So the things that we really need to capture correctly in camera. One is the focal length of the subject and the background. Those should match as closely as possible. And they don't right now, and I'll get to why in a second. But that's the first thing is focal length. The second thing is the angle of the image. So the angle of the background and the angle of the Deadpool should match. And when I speak to angle, I mean, if you look at the background here, all of these lines that go off into the distance, all the kind of the Z-axis lines, they all go back, and they all go back at different angles to a common vanishing point, which is somewhere in here. Let me grab a better, somewhere in here. And if you look at Deadpool, he'll also have vanishing points. It's much harder to see in Deadpool because he doesn't have straight lines or corners, but he will also have a vanishing point. And those vanishing points basically need to match. The third thing we want to cover is light. How does the light on the Deadpool match the light that's actually in the scene? So if you look at the scene itself, all the light is coming from this the end of the tunnel here, and the sunlight that's coming through the end of the tunnel. That's all the light sources that are coming from it. If you look at Deadpool, he's got light coming from the front because he's got these reflections. He's got light coming from the sides, which does not match the scene at all. So we're going to have to tweak those as well. So let's start covering these one by one. So the first thing is the focal length. The focal length is a bit of a complicated subject that I'm not going to cover fully here, but the basic gist of it is that all lenses, when they say that they're a 30 millimeter lens or a 16 millimeter lens, that is based on a reference sensor size, which is basically a full frame camera sensor size. And if you have a sensor in your camera that is larger or smaller, then they have what's called a crop factor that adjusts the actual lens of what the lens that you have to the sensor size to get the equivalent of what it is on a full frame camera. So it's kind of the equivalency factor is the term. So what we need to do is match the equivalent of our camera for the Deadpool and our camera for the background and make sure they're as close as possible. What we have here is the background, which was shot on my cell phone, which is a Pixel 5. And the lens for the Pixel 5 is actually a 4.67 millimeter lens on the camera itself, but it has a very small sensor. So the crop factor for that sensor is 5.5. So to find the equivalency, you multiply the focal length, which is 4.67, times 5.5, and you get roughly 25.7. So we need to match the camera I used to shoot Deadpool to the equivalency of 25.7. What I shot this exact Deadpool with was a 35 millimeter lens on a Sony a6000. And the Sony a6000 has a crop factor of 1.5. So if you do the math, that works out to a 52 millimeter equivalent lens. So 27 is basically half of 52. So the Deadpool here is actually zoomed in a lot more than the background image, so it doesn't quite match. So the solution here is to change the lens on the Sony to shoot Deadpool to closely match the equivalent focal length of the background. So the way I did that is I have a 16 millimeter lens for the Sony. So I swapped out the 35 for the 16, and if you do the math, the 16 millimeter with a 1.5 crop factor is 24 millimeters, and 24 millimeters is close enough to 25.7 that it makes no real difference. So that is the lens I'm going to use for the rest of this shoot. So that's sorted. We have to figure out the other two things. So the second thing was the angle of Deadpool to the scene, and because the vanishing lines are hard to tell on Deadpool, the best way to kind of figure it out is find a matching plane and then find out a matching plane on Deadpool and the scene and see if they match. So with Deadpool, the matching plane that's easy to figure out is his feet. Both of his feet should be on the ground, and it's a flat ground, so they should be at the same plane. So an equivalent plane on the image is this doorway here. And I'm going to use this door sill. It's not quite perfect, but it's good enough. And that's the theme of this is it good enough? Is it believable? As Joel Grimes calls it, selling the fake. Is it close enough to sell the fake? So we're going to try to match Deadpool. So it looks like this line here is the same as this line here. So to do that, I'm just going to grab the Deadpool and just move him over and just kind of stick it so his front foot looks like he's on the windowsill. And if I do that, it's a bit hard to tell, but you can see his toes. They're not quite touching the ground. I'll move him over here so you can see if he's on the windowsill. His front foot, his back foot is up about one brick length from the back there. So that is not correct. So we're going to have to adjust the camera angle. Changing the focal length is also going to adjust the angle. So the first iteration, I'm just going to change the camera lens and see how that affects the angle. And then any iterations after that, I will actually move the camera up and down. The third thing that we have to match is the light. So the light in the background, as we mentioned, is all coming from the square in the back here. but the light on him is coming from the sides and the front. Now I probably always want a front light because the front light kind of just keeps him from becoming a shadow. And clearly this scene has some sort of bouncing light from the front to illuminate some of this stuff. So so we're going to need some front light, but probably not as much as we have. And the side lights here, we need to turn into a backlight. And the way I'm going to do that is to turn off the lume cubes and put in a white card in the background so the light will reflect off the white card and shine forward. Then I'll have a front light and the ambient light of the light box to kind of make sure that Deadpool doesn't become one big shadow. So that's going to be my second iteration. So let's see what that looks like. So this is Deadpool from the second iteration, and I've already done the quick selecting. As you can see, it's not perfect, but as I said, we don't really care. And you can see the angle. If I bring both the first and the second together, you will see that the angles are a bit different. Deadpool here looks like he's more spread out front to back than he does on this one here, which is what you'd expect because a wider camera lens tends to elongate the scene a little bit. Let's see how it all works out. So I'm just going to grab the second iteration, and the first thing I'm going to check is the angle. So if I move him over to the windowsill and plop him on there, you can see that the angle has actually gotten worse. So you can see that the focal length change actually changed the angle, but not in the way that was beneficial to us. So I'm going to have to actually move the camera down a bit to kind of change the angle of Deadpool. So I'm going to have to move the angle of the camera. The other thing we had to worry about was the light. So all the light on the background is coming from that card. And as you can see, it's actually working because we're getting rim lights on Deadpool from the background. But we're still getting a lot of front light. There's a reflection on his leg guard here that's coming from the front light. And that really wouldn't be on the scene. If you look at the scene on the sides here, all these little edges are like on these windowsills. There's no highlights on the front side of those. Any highlights come from the back, but we have highlights on our front. So that's a mismatch that we're going to have to adjust. One way I think of doing that is to, instead of just having light reflect from the back here, is actually take the lume cubes and shine it on the back so there's more light shining, bouncing off and coming forward. And then that way I can adjust the camera a little bit so that it looks like more light is coming from the back and kind of compensate for the fact that there's a lot of light on the front. All right, so this is iteration 3 that I've thrown the quick mask on, and it's looking a little bit different. So I think the lights are actually working a little bit. I've had some lume cubes shining off that white card and coming back, and that has caused a little bit of glow around the outside edges. We are still getting a little bit of front light from the front here. The one issue that I do see that's significant with the light is the leg here is getting washed out, and that shouldn't be the case. If you look at the scene itself goes from a fairly dark shadow in the front, and it gets lighter as it goes behind. But if you look at where Deadpool sits, the front to back, like with his door here, the front to back is all pretty much an even light. So or an even shadow. So the shadows from the front to back of Deadpool should be roughly the same, and they're not. And odds are I'm just getting too much light coming off the back, and it's washing out the back of him. So I need to adjust that. The second thing is to look at is the angles. So let's bring them over to our reference part of the image and stick them on this door sill. So if I stick them on the door sill, the front of him is on the door sill, and the back is actually lower. So I moved the camera down to reduce this angle, but I moved it too much. So in the next iteration, I'm going to have to move the camera back up a bit to try to even that out. So those are the two things I need to work about: is backlight spill and the angle. So let's tweak that and get to the next thing. So this is the fourth iteration, and I think things are starting to actually look pretty good. So I moved the camera up a little bit to tweak the angle. So let's take a look at that angle and see if it works. I'll move him over to our reference door frame, and I'll stick him on the windowsill. And as you can see, it's looking pretty good. It's not quite perfect, but it's good enough. Things don't have to be exact, but good enough is, well, good enough. So Deadpool, the angle looks pretty much correct. So let's look at the light. And one thing I'm noticing is that the front to backness of his leg is actually much improved now that we've dropped the Lume Cube light intensity that's bouncing off the back. Another thing I've done is removed the front light. So we're no longer getting those highlights along the front of his legs. So that more matches the scene that's going on. However, there are some issues. His knife is still getting washed out. I think the edges, part of that, the edges is just the quick selection. It wasn't perfect, but also the middle of it though is still black and that, or still glowy, and there's light wrap, and it should be dark, or at least darker. So that is a problem that I'll need to address. And one of the things I think is causing it is that these Lume cubes, if I take away the selection and see the shot itself, these Lume cubes are shining onto the background and then shining onto Deadpool, but they're also shining because they just go everywhere. Like once it leaves the edge of the actual light itself, it just shines in all directions, and it's hitting these reflectors on the sides and then shining light into as well. So both of these are shining light. If you notice, the light issue is more on the left side here, which is the same side where this light is more closer to the side of the light box and getting more reflection. So I think we're getting some from that. So there's a solution to that, which is adding barn doors, which helps control the light. But our angles are good, so it's just tweaking the light, and then we should be in the butter zone. So this is the fifth iteration. I did not change the camera angle, although I did change his pose slightly just to make it a little bit more dramatic, but the camera angle is has not changed, so the angle should be perfectly fine. And the light is actually much improved. The brightness from front to back is much better. There is still a little bit of light wrap that is causing the knife to get a little bit faint, and the back of his legs to be a little bit faint, but it's within the realm of fixable in post. When it comes to post, the things that are hard to fix are angles, focal length, and general light. But anything else other than that is tweakable, and we are well within the realm of tweakable. So I'm going to declare this to be a success, and this fifth iteration of our process is going to be the one that I'm going to use to finish off this shot. So let's see how I actually finish off this shot. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail simply because this is more about how to match composites and not how to finish things off, which is really more artistic. And it's entirely up to you as the artist to finish off your own shots the way you want it. But let's give a quick overview about how I do it. So first to start off with the Deadpool itself, and I went through and took the time to actually capture a really good mask of Deadpool, so he's got all the details that he needs, but without any of the artifacts from the quick select. I also cleaned up some of his joints because I don't really like joints. I'm still stuck with these really ugly shoulders, but that's part of the model itself, so there's not a whole lot I can do about that, so I'm just going to live with it. But everything else is pretty good to go. And I just need to kind of center it in the scene and match colors and shadows. So speaking of shadows, I also added the shadows at the bottom there, because any object that's in a scene is going to be affected by the light in the scene, and that's going to cause both highlights and shadows, especially contact shadows with the ground, and that really anchors Deadpool to the ground. This is a little bit floaty. This is locked to the ground. So I just added to that, and I just do that with a very light black brush with like low opacity and low flow, and just click on it a few times until I get the right consistency of the shadows. Then I added some dodging and burning and some highlights just to add a little bit of rim light and to darken up the front of the leg just a little bit more, and add a little bit of grit to it, and just kind of added some shadow to the front. And then I added this texture. I am a big, huge honking fan of textures. I like the grit that they add to a scene. And in this particular texture I like because if you look at the texture itself, it's got these yellows in it, and it's got these grays in it, and it's bright. So whatever scene you put it onto, it also brightens it up, and then these differences in tones kind of just add some interest to the whole piece as well. So if I bring back everything else, you can see that it does exactly that. It brightens up the scene. It adds a little bit of grit to everything, and it just kind of gives it more of a punch. And then finally, I just did some color grading with some color lookup tables, and just to tweak the colors of it and to get it a little bit darker around the edges and a little bit brighter in the center because your eye is drawn to bright. And that just kind of centers the feel of this image right to this box here. So your eye kind of goes right to this box and then it can wander off, but it's centered around this box. So that is my final image, and I hope you enjoyed it in the process of how to, or at least how I match objects to backgrounds, and hope you'll be able to use this in your own work. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.